Research Institution Committee. I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Alicia Knoedler, who is leading this final session of our January virtual FDP meeting, as Sarah mentioned. In 2021, the National Science Foundation selected Dr. Knoedler to head NSF's Office of Integrative Activities, which, as the name suggests, has a strategic role in implementing cross-disciplinary coordination for unifying NSF's programs to increase their impact. Dr. Knoedler's doctorate is in cognitive psychology, and she has an extensive background in research development and innovation, as well as having served as a faculty member at public and private institutions of higher education. As Vice President for Research at 2 public research universities, she's broadened participation of underserved groups and worked to develop human and infrastructure capacity in research operations. I will quote from NSF's website because it says it much better than I could. Her career has focused on cultivating and expanding research and innovation, emphasizing collaborative interdisciplinary work aligned with institutional strengths and interests, as well as the development and cultivation of strong and diverse research infrastructure and competitive capacity. The CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 has advancing diversity in STEM as one of its focus areas. This is applicable to other federal agencies as well as NSF. For NSF, this increases opportunities for minority serving institutions, emerging research institutions in rural communities, increases NSF investments in EPSCoR jurisdictions, and establishes a Chief Diversity Officer at NSF to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. FDP's emerging research institutions will be especially interested in Dr. Knoedler's presentation today. And as co-chair of the FDP ERI committee, I look forward to coordinating follow-on conversations among our ERI membership in preparation for our in-person FDP meeting in Washington in May. Dr. Knoedler, I also want to let you know that your colleague, Lisa Scott Mooring, Division of Grants and Agreements Deputy Director, has agreed to serve as the ERI Committee's federal co-chair. Excellent. Dr. Knoedler, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen with some slides. Hopefully you're seeing the right orientation of these slides. So thank you again for this opportunity. I'm very excited to focus on a few things, but primarily to talk about a new program, new initiative actually within NSF called Granted. So I'm going to spend a little time peeling back the layers of an onion, so to speak, to get to Granted in more detail. So I won't take longer to get started. So kind of the organization of this presentation starts with some NSF agency context that I want to bring forward that's relevant to some of what Susan said already, some of the things I hope you're interested in hearing about. I'm going to talk a little bit about cross-disciplinary conceptualizations within NSF and hopefully talking about things in a little slightly different way than maybe what you've been familiar with inside NSF. I'll talk about broadening participation from an agency perspective, and then finally get to the Granted program. I do hope that you will ask questions, and I hope I will have answers because this is a new initiative. Some of what we're trying to figure out is an evolution for Granted, but I do hope that this is a discussion. So in my presentation, I leave room for us to have some good conversation at the end. So let me first very quickly tell you a little bit about myself in case you don't know who I am. I have spent, and I know that Susan gave a little bit of my bio, but I have a very eclectic pathway to the position that I now have at NSF. But I've started very traditionally. I've received a cognitive psychology degree or degrees. Trinity University was my undergraduate institution, very small institution, liberal arts in San Antonio, Texas. Received my master's and PhD at Purdue. And I spent quite a bit of time teaching early in my career at places like Ivy Tech, which is a community college system in Indiana, but also spent some time teaching at Indiana University, San Jose State, UC Santa Cruz, and so on. Eventually, I ended up at Notre Dame, and there's when I switched from providing instruction and having my own research program to helping other people with their research programs. So I moved into research administration and then into research development and eventually research leadership, kind of cutting across those institutions there from Notre Dame to Penn State, University of Oklahoma, and then Miami University. And then I joined NSF in 2021. And I'm again leading OIA, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But I've also been plugged in nationally for quite some time in the areas of research leadership development, broadening participation. And I've been active in NORDP, the National Organization of Research Development Professionals, and APLU, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, really trying to do this work collectively with so many other great colleagues across the nation. So I wanted to provide that. I'm kind of traditional, but not very traditional in a sort of tenure line faculty kind of way. But my expertise comes in thinking about how institutions build research capacity. So let me talk a little bit about OIA. So NSF, I like to talk NSF as sort of being organized like a research university. And I find that this is very helpful to a lot of people who aren't as familiar with NSF, or maybe are familiar with other federal agencies, but don't know how NSF is different. So we're organized by directorates and offices, those are kind of like colleges at a university. Within those directorates, we have divisions, which are more like departments or maybe schools, depending on the language institutions use. And then programs within the divisions are more like faculty's research programs or projects. So it kind of funnels down into that sort of way. We have a lot of autonomy and independence across our programs. The divisions and directorates have a lot of similarities across them, but they are disciplinarily organized. Then we have NSF offices, like university offices, and we have the office of the director, which would be like university leadership, a president's office, provost, and so on. And OIA is part of the office of the director. So we're like a directorate. There's two offices that are like directorates, the Office of Integrative Activities and the Office of International Science and Engineering, OISE. And so we kind of act in these very directorate-like ways. OIA is particularly cross-cutting, and we also do some operational work for the agency. We are also the hub for the director's office when it comes to broadening participation at NSF. And some programs you're probably familiar with coming out of OIA. We have the EPSCoR program for the agency, the HBCU Excellence in Research program, the Major Research Instrumentation program, MRI, Mid-Scale Research Infrastructure Track 1, and then two larger convergence collaboration opportunities, Growing Convergence Research, and the Science and Technology Centers. So in kind of evolving into broad priorities for NSF, we have three major priorities that guide much of our work: strengthening the established NSF, which is very much about the discipline and cross-disciplinary work that's happening at NSF; inspiring the missing millions, which is all about broadening participation, diversity, equity, and inclusion; and accelerating technology and innovation. And this is through the use-inspired work that now is primarily led by the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, but is really a cross-cutting concept throughout NSF as well, and I'll come back to that. I also like to point out that NSF and its areas of focus, its priorities, and so on, are very aligned with the National Science Board, as well as the White House and its administrative pillars. And so this slide in particular highlights a few areas of overlap, but the accessibility and inclusivity, which has been a defining part of my own career, is substantially represented across all three areas, all three perspectives. And this kind of alignment has really allowed us to build in new ways, new areas, broaden the number of participants within NSF as well as outside of NSF. And it's an incredibly exciting time to be at NSF, to be able to build out greater inclusivity, access and really strive toward more equitable approaches in what we do. And I also want to highlight 3 documents, NSB's Vision 2030, I mentioned on the earlier slide, but this is something from the National Science Board. And then NSF has a relatively new strategic plan that it issued last year. And then we have the FY23 budget request, which has just been appropriated. And so we are now finally being able to get started with our FY23 now that we're in the second quarter for the fiscal year. So let me talk a little bit about some cross-disciplinary conceptualizations to highlight these for you, especially if you think of NSF as being very directorate-driven and disciplinarily siloed, which I think we all strive not to be, but there are some elements of the community, the research community in different disciplines that really like the way in which they're able to focus in their own areas. But these areas that I want to highlight are very cross-disciplinary. So the new directorate, I'm sure you're familiar with this, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, the TIP directorate. It has unique investment programs. And one I want to highlight for you that's just been released is the Enabling Partnerships to Increase Innovation Capacity, EPIC program. There is some overlap with the granted program and EPIC, and I'm happy to answer questions about that, talk about that as well later on. But components of TIP, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, are also integrated within every directorate and office throughout NSF. So we are having partnership discussions in OIA. We have always embraced innovation and thought about new ways of doing things within our office. But we're really working across, and the leadership team of NSF is incredibly collaborative, and being able to have this direction of, hey, we not only have this new directorate, but we expect that everyone will understand the concepts of TIP within their own contexts. And so that really helps that collaboration and helps us think together to help TIP get off the ground, but also to find points of intersection throughout the agency. EPSCoR, which has been around for 40 years, so it's certainly not a new program, but we have some new things going on there. The funding program that has been part of OIA's funding portfolio and represents geographic diversity for NSF, we have our investment programs that come in the form of the Research Infrastructure Improvement Grants, workshops, as well as co-funding. But in CHIPS and Science, there was a plan to increase funding to EPSCoR jurisdictions by 20% of NSF's budget by 2029. And so this type of goal, we're sort of starting, I believe, in FY23, we were probably about 13%, 12 to 13% of NSF's budget went to EPSCoR jurisdictions. So to get to 20% by 2029, means we need to do a lot of focused outreach and a lot of encouragement to have more proposals from EPSCoR jurisdictions, to understand how capacity for research and research funding needs to grow in different ways than what we've done in the past. Through EPSCoR programming, that's going to be an important part of what we do. And in case you're not familiar or you weren't aware, we have a new report on envisioning the future of NSF EPSCoR. That's on the NSF EPSCoR's website. It has a number of recommendations to NSF about how we need to do a few things differently to support the EPSCoR mission. And we will hopefully in FY23 be releasing some new opportunities that are aligned with that report. ERIs, important to FTP, very important to NSF, emerging research institutions. So this collective term right now is helping to organize our outreach and our engagement. It's helping us to think differently about the institutions that have been successful with NSF and those that might struggle in that regard or might want to grow their capacity to connect with NSF. But it's also a way in which we can thoughtfully think about the distinctiveness across the whole research enterprise, which is fundamental to the granted program. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The easiest way, we get asked a lot of times, what is the list of ERIs? Well, the easiest way to identify a set of ERIs is through NCSES's HERD survey, which provides research expenditures, and the definition of ERIs, which I'll get to in another slide, is set in the context of research expenditures, but for FY21, Table 22 would help you identify ERIs, a certain subset of them. Not all of them are represented there. And then I wanted to highlight a concept inside the agency that we call NSF's equity ecosystem. And we have just welcomed last week a new Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, NSF's first person in this role. So we're incorporating him into, his name is Chuck Barber, that we're incorporating him into NSF's equity ecosystem. And then the ecosystem is a way in which to help us think across a lot of different parts of NSF, the internal NSF employee relations, the funding portfolio, how we engage the external community, what are our equity activities inside the foundation, and also how we address many of the White House executive orders that are equity related. So there's so much activity that's going on across NSF, and by characterizing an equity ecosystem, it really helps us in that those cross-cutting and cross-communicative things that we need to be doing, but it also highlights how our learning and knowledge sharing is really critically important to thinking about how we're building this out to a new level or to greater impact. And without some kind of guiding organization, I think we'd have a lot of people doing a lot of great work, but it wouldn't be able to scale and go to the next level. So that's really what we're trying to do there. I also think that's going to help us with future programming, future solicitation development, and so on. We do have an advisory committee that we've had since 1980, the CIOS Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering. And that committee has always advised NSF on broadening participation. And so the equity ecosystem makes full use of the CIOS committee as well. So I wanted to highlight for you that we do try. It's hard to keep up with many new programs. Every fiscal year, we have many new programs that get started inside NSF, but we do have an updated broadening participation website for NSF. And so there's the link there. When I make the slides available, I'll make sure that the links all work and that you find this information easily. But I want to direct you to the program portfolio list, and in particular, the Dear Colleague letters that are listed there. That is the quick way in which NSF alerts the research community to new programs or guides their attention to proposals that NSF wants to encourage, maybe to existing program descriptions or solicitations. So those Dear Colleague letters are often new directions or new ways in which we are building out our broadening participation activities. And so on this particular page, the program portfolio for the broadening participation in STEM website is a great resource for your institutions to take a look and see where they might fit in terms of ideas for training, for development of research capacity, for research ideas as well. So I want to share a little bit of data with you because I am a cognitive psychologist. I love my data, but at the same time, I want to make sure that you know where to get these data so that you can look for your own patterns and trends that you're interested in. So first, I want to just give a broad overview of the annual budget for FY22 for NSF was around 8.8 billion, and we fund or have funded, I think based on those numbers, approximately 27% of all federally funded basic research that's conducted by America's colleges and universities. And we have this relatively new system called NSF by the numbers. It's been around for over a year, but I hope if you're not familiar with it, that you will become familiar with it. It's got a lot of interesting information state by state, some trend information, and you can go in and filter and take a look at a lot of different comparisons within NSF by the numbers. So you can also get it on your app, as an app on your phone, your tablet, and so on, but it is a web active website as well. So let me give you just a few bits and pieces that I want to highlight around NSF proposals and awards and our success rate and so on. So here's a figure for proposals evaluated from FY 2011 to FY 2022. The blue line at the top is the NSF total. And then the two lines down lower across that giant gap there represent EPSCoR jurisdictions. So those are proposals evaluated that came from institutions in EPSCoR jurisdictions, and then minority serving institutions. And something not only do I want to highlight that gap, and yes, those EPSCoR and MSI institutions are represented in the overall NSF numbers, but you can't quite see in the EPSCoR and MSI lines that there's a decline in proposals from both of those populations of institutions, but you can see pretty clearly in the NSF total line that we have seen a decline in proposals over time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and what NSF is trying to do to increase proposals. But it is something that I want to make sure people are aware of, because in order for the agency to grow, and although more money for people who have been competitive with NSF is a great thing, but we also want to include new populations of investigators, new early career faculty, people just getting started. And so we need more proposals to be able to fund those new populations in NSF, but also to keep asking for those increased funds that we all are interested in NSF receiving. So the decline in proposals is something that we are focused on within the agency. For MSIs, the decline, or MSIs represent about 11% of the proposals that are evaluated at NSF, and EPSCoR jurisdictions account for about 14% of the proposals evaluated. When we look at awards, the gap still there. These are new awards issued between FY 2011 and FY 2022, but the patterns look so very similar. The other thing I wanted to point out for both proposals and awards is that the MSI pattern and the EPSCoR pattern are pretty much on top of each other. And so that makes for a very interesting set of ways in which we do outreach and engagement to institutions, both in EPSCoR jurisdictions, but also outside of EPSCoR jurisdictions, and the ERI collective that I think we want to talk more about. So we are looking to add a few more figures and other ways to look at ERI data in NSF by the numbers. It is taking us a little while just to organize the data with new tags to enable us to do that. But we do hope that eventually we'll have an ERI type of view in NSF by the numbers as well. And then very quickly, the funding rates for all of these different groups, NSF as a whole, MSIs, EPSCoR, they're all roughly the same. Approximately 14% of NSF's funded institutions are MSIs, and 16% are entities in EPSCoR jurisdictions. So that includes institutions as well as other entities like companies in the SBIR, STTR program, and so on. And then the award obligations to MSIs represent about 14% of NSF's portfolio. And for EPSCoR jurisdictions, it's slightly smaller, 13%. So again, all of these data are available. You can take a look, you can sort and filter through them by the NSF by the numbers dashboard. And I just wanted to call out same kinds of populations by directorate. So these are by the disciplinary directorates, the science and engineering directorates. TIP is not included because I couldn't really do a historical perspective on that. And although TIP does, or I'm sorry, NSF by the numbers does allow you to look at TIP as an organization, because so many programs from other directorates moved into TIP. There is some historical data, but really what we want to do is look at TIP going forward. So I just left that out from this view at this point. So these are proposals evaluated. You can see that like the blue line to the gold line, that's from 2012 to 2022, and there's a drop in proposals during that time. So we've had this drop that is very compelling to us. But if you look at the MSI data, the proposals evaluated are a little bit more consistent. I don't think we're seeing the same kind of drop in MSIs, but it's a smaller population of institutions. And then awards, We don't see a drop in awards. We've had increasing funding in most cases. We do see a few drops here and there, but generally speaking, what we know that the award data is very closely aligned with the number of proposals that are coming in and being evaluated. So without more proposals, we can't issue more awards. So we do want to see more proposals for sure. So let me give a few takeaways from the data. Most of NSF's intersectional data, so you might be highly curious about a whole lot of things that I just presented, but most of the intersectional data are not available to the public. However, we have this new broad agency announcement. So we're dabbling more in the BAA world. So we have a broad agency announcement for contracts to do more data analytics with NSF data. And the program's called Analytics for Equity. And so the solicitation is now out and open for people to put in their submissions. We do have public sources of data. We have the NSB's Merit Review Digest. We've published that for many years. The NSF Award Search, which is part of NSF by the Numbers now. And then I showed you some of the data from NSF by the Numbers. You all have your institutional sources of data. So you could certainly look at your own patterns of data, and I would encourage you to do so. I know that oftentimes in some institutions, there's just not capacity for doing that. And that's something I want you to keep in mind when I talk about the granted initiative. General success rates are around 28%, or at least in FY22 they were, and greater appropriations help our success rates increase. So thank you to all of you who have worked very hard to help us make the case for increased funding for NSF. And our internal analyses show repeatedly that award success mirrors competitive proposal submissions. So without those proposal submissions, we're not going to see the award success, especially in the populations where we're trying to expand. So let me talk a minute about emerging research institutions. So this is a new concept or a new umbrella term. It came through the CHIPS and Science Act, also in the predecessors to that act. But the definition is as follows: an institution of higher education with an established undergraduate or graduate program that has less than $50 million in federal research expenditures in any particular year. So when we look at the data, let's say from the NCSES HERD data, which is public data, I'm using FY21, which is the most recent survey that's been released. So how many ERIs are there? And there's a little counting error that I put in there just because I'm human. So there's over 500 ERI institutions in the HERD survey. There's far more ERIs, those that don't report through the HERD survey. So we're talking about a substantial population of institutions, and approximately 112, give or take a few, are in EPSCoR jurisdictions. All HBCUs, according to FY21 HERD data, are ERIs, but not all MSIs are ERIs. There are several R1 Hispanic serving institutions, at least 16, that are not ERIs. And there are around 160 non-ERIs in the US, and 39 of those are in EPSCoR jurisdictions, approximately 25% of the non-ERIs. So sometimes we think it's easier to talk about those institutions that are not emerging research institutions because the list is long for emerging research institutions. And earlier I said, and some R1 institutions are ERIs and some R2s are not ERIs. So it's all fascinating if you dig in the data and take a look. So the other thing I wanted to mention in the context of EPSCoR jurisdictions is this, in the appropriation CHIPS and Science, that there was a plan to increase funding for institutions that are in EPSCoR jurisdictions. And this is kind of the plan, the percentage of NSF's budget each year. And the goal is to get to 20% by FY29. Without more proposals, this will be difficult for us to do. It's not all about just the appropriations and the funds that are available, but we need competitive proposals coming from EPSCoR jurisdictions. So it all starts with more proposals, but that's true of all across all populations and research communities, not just EPSCoR. So the agency has an agency priority goal. It is through FY23, but we have the opportunity to assess, and we're doing that work now, to decide if we want to continue with this agency priority goal. But what we're trying to do is increase the number of proposals from groups that are underrepresented in STEM, both the individuals as well as the institutions, by 10% by the end of this fiscal year. And this has been tough to do. The pandemic has not helped, but we've also really tried to understand why there's kind of this continual drop, especially in FY22. There was more of a drop in proposals. Some of it is still a function of the pandemic and whatnot. We also have more no deadline programs, and without a deadline looming, sometimes it's hard to get that proposal finished up and submitted. So there's probably a lot of reasons, but we're also interested in hearing from you, and we have some guesses as to why there are some challenges in getting proposals submitted. But we are interested in those conversations to have more insight into these particular patterns. We do give quarterly updates via this performance.gov page, and I encourage you to look at that to see how NSF is doing with respect to this agency priority goal. So a few other things I want to highlight before I turn to the granted program. You know, in the context of all that I've talked about and pulling together a few other kind of big picture behavioral challenges that happen in the research community, whether you're new faculty just getting started or whether your institution has different research priorities than the research priorities you have, there are some general issues in research funding success. And some of this thinking, I'm trying to give you some insight into what led us into the early development of the granted initiative. So one is access. And I have a few quotes here from listening sessions that we've had with institutions that kind of represent some of these issues. So access. I've spent my entire career trying to help people find good fits for resources that align with their research programs. And that's not always easy. Sometimes investigators don't want to change up what they're doing. Sometimes it's just not a good fit. Maybe there's too many hoops to jump through in a solicitation. Whatever it happens to be, providing access and making sure that people can find resources is a challenge. And so how effectively are we doing that as an agency? How effectively are we doing that as a federal government? How effective are private foundations and other entities that provide resources? But there are sort of more personal issues too. This quote, I didn't realize that I could go talk to a program officer. Sometimes people just don't have an ally in their day-to-day work that tells them, yes, you can talk to a program officer. Here's how. Here's a great way to do it. So we need to have sort of this broader community that is helping fill in the gaps where we know things are happening and where people aren't getting access like some people are other places. So inclusion is another area, another challenge. So this quote here, I don't see myself and my work in that solicitation, and really thinking broadly about what it is that we're trying to or how we're trying to succeed in the funding opportunities that we provide, but also how are we communicating successes so that people can see sort of something similar in the work that they do in something that's been funded by NSF or any other agency or any other funding resource organization. So how are we effectively communicating our successes and helping people see themselves in the agency? Intentionally developing workforce. So this is true on the research side, students and faculty, staff, and so on. But it's also the case that in the research enterprise, which is the fundamental focus for granted, intentionally building pathways to help people find research enterprise positions in research administration, research development, tech transfer, public-private partnerships. I know that there's plenty of you out there in the audience who have accidentally found these jobs. I totally accidentally found the first job I had in research administration. We have to make this intentional. We have to help people think about this as a viable career pathway in STEM or in other areas. But there's also the case that in a lot of different positions in the workforce, that there's a lot of how do I want to say this? There's demand on the bandwidth of a single person. So this quote here, my sponsored research office or officer is the vice president for academic affairs. So at some institutions, people who are research leaders might also be leaders of the academic programs or the leader for multiple other parts of the institution. So we have to think broadly about bandwidth and the work streams that individuals are doing in these areas, and think about the intentionality of building out competencies, position descriptions, advancement pathways, and so on. And I know a lot of professional societies have done this, but how can we do this in a more integrated way? And then finally, there are many varying experiences for individuals and institutions across the research communities. And every time we have a listening session, I just kind of find it heartbreaking that I can't help every single person who has struggled somewhere along the line to get access to resources for their work. They haven't found a program that fits. They haven't been successful in submitting their proposal, or once they submitted their proposal, it wasn't actually funded. So there's so many different ways in which people can be supported in their efforts to build out the work that they're trying to do. And how is it that we can play a role in supporting the infrastructure, the research enterprise that really helps all of these other individuals, faculty, investigators, other staff, and so on, be successful. So it's with some of these big issues, inclusion and access, but being intentional in helping people experience things perhaps in a more equitable way, that we thought to develop this new program called Granted. So Granted is an acronym, stands for Growing Research Access for Nationally Transformative Equity and Diversity. And yes, that was very tricky to come up with, but it works. And there's kind of other ways of thinking about this. I like to think about the positive sense of granted. I've been granted an award, or I've been granted a new opportunity, but it also fits in the other meaning of I have taken this for granted. And I think that what I have experienced, what I have a lot of colleagues have experienced, is that the research enterprise, this part of the research infrastructure and backbone that helps support all of the people that submit scientific proposals, build out research programs for their careers, their faculty, their staff, and other leaders, and so on, that the people who help them do this work are potentially in the background, or they're invisible, or that they haven't been front and center, or that people haven't quite recognized the work and the support that they provide. And so we don't want to take those people for granted. And I think the pandemic, and I'm sure some of you have had some experiences like this, that the landscape has changed for many of these positions. Some research admin offices are fully remote. And in some cases, institutions that are very well resourced have figured out how to make those positions remote. And they are recruiting from across the country now, because people aren't required to move to be part of the research admin office, as an example, at an institution. And those individuals might be coming from institutions that don't have the salaries at the same level. They don't have the remote aspect to the jobs. And so I'm hearing from across the research community how many challenges there are with people changing jobs or leaving. One institution that I talked to that had a single grant writer for the entire institution, it was an ERI, that person left, and now they're completely paralyzed when it comes to being able to submit proposals. They did not have another person to help them out. And so what are we doing nationally to make sure that we have a healthy and robust research enterprise? All of these functions that support the work that is happening to make us globally competitive in our science and engineering, our technology advancements, our arts and humanities. What are we doing to make sure that the nation is competitive in this regard. So Granted is established to think about that backbone, that infrastructure, the research enterprise that is made up of, and this infographic is kind of a way in which I try to use it to carve out and show people that there are multiple facets to the research enterprise: research development types positions, broader impacts, research development positions, could be all sorts of different titles, research administration, pre and post award, sponsored programs, and so on, tech transfer, economic development, commercialization and licensing, public-private partnerships, corporate relations, research integrity, research security, export controls, but even the folks that help the students be active in research programs. So this might be offices of undergraduate research. These are folks who are helping people develop their dissertations, teaching methodology, responsible conduct of research. So there's so many staff that contribute to this kind of training, but also dealing with all of the research policy demands that federal agencies, yes, I'm not in control of all the research policy demands, but there are many, I acknowledge that. And so how do institutions keep up with that? Well, they have highly trained people who can help with that. Not every institution does, but keeping up with new things around open access and data requirements, all of these things are coming at you left and right. And then finally, research leadership, which is where we need to make sure that people who are coming into research leadership positions are very knowledgeable about the entire research enterprise and how it functions within their institution, but also how it functions and connects across the national landscape. So the parts of the Granted acronym that are incredibly important from getting us started is the access part, making sure that we are creating accessible ways in which to have these conversations, to think of new ideas in the research enterprise space, but also national transformation, that plenty of professional societies and institutions and so on have great training programs, they have skill development, they have advancement pathways and so on, but the nation's research enterprise is not robust, it's fragile. And what are we doing? What is NSF doing? And then hopefully as we expand over several years, how is it that we're working in partnership with other federal agencies, professional societies, and so on to build this robust and very sustainable research enterprise? So, oops, sorry, okay, there we go. So a few things in the first year of the Granted initiative as we roll out a couple of funding opportunities. We're focusing on strengthening the nation's research enterprise. We want to mitigate barriers to competitiveness and enhance research capacity, especially at emerging research institutions and underserved research institutions, such as minority serving institutions in particular. So we are looking to enhance that research administrative support and infrastructure supporting research admin leadership. Don't put too much emphasis on administration in the context of pre and post award, but it's all of these different functions in the infographic there, and also partnering with national and regional professional societies to do this work. And the webpage there I listed nsf.gov/granted is where you get more information. So very quickly, I want to carve this infographic up just a little bit because I know that there among the research institutions in FTP, there are many well-resourced institutions, and you may not be an MSI or you may not be an emerging research institution, but there's plenty of work to be done and contribute nationally. So there's kind of four components to this infographic. This upper quadrant is really about kind of getting ideas together and putting in applications and being able to steward awards around research projects and research programs. In the context of TIP, in particular for NSF, but also thinking about use-inspired work, the second quadrant is all about the tech transfer and the research commercialization, the partnerships, and so on. This third quadrant is about developing the foundational pieces of the research enterprise, research integrity and compliance, but also the training components, the talent development, and so on. And then this upper quadrant, the fourth quadrant, is really about the policy and the research leadership. And well-resourced institutions have much to contribute in these spaces, But again, I want to emphasize how much this is about the national research enterprise, not just one institution being successful, but how the success at an institution might lead to a national model or be able to help the national research enterprise, again, become more robust and sustainable. So let me very quickly talk about a few funding opportunities and where we're headed with the initiative right now. So we have a Dear Colleague letter that's out. And this is to support conferences and convenings. Those proposals are due March 15th, 2023. We have money that is allocated and appropriated to us to spend. We need to spend it. So we put a deadline on there to encourage proposals. And we're and the reason why we did this initially was because we wanted to make sure that communities that have a lot in common, but may not be in the same circles, come together to be able to share those ideas and share either the common challenges or barriers they want to reduce, and that they could first put in a proposal to do a convening and bring people together and talk about those ideas. And then for the next funding opportunity for Granted, which we're currently developing, is that those convenings might allow people to say, oh, I know exactly what kind of proposal we want to put in for the next granted funding opportunity. But this next funding opportunity will be very much about building capacity and reducing barriers, especially within minority serving institutions, but also emerging research institutions and the whole of the research enterprise. We're looking for knowledge sharing. We're looking for ways in which people are working together to do this work. So if we think about, again, the infographic, I just went through that in quite a bit of detail. You'll see a lot of the different areas: human capital development, practices and policy development, what are effective practices, what are some processes people do, but different skill building, competency building. There's so much in this space. There's just so much that could be done. There should not be any lack of ideas. But we're also looking at enhancing the practices and processes that can be scaled up, that can be shared in other contexts. You know, there might be ways in which people have good training programs, but they've never been tested in certain types of contexts. So are there ideas that could do that kind of work? But we also, and I want to highlight this for FDP, we're looking for professional societies to take the lead, do a convening, do something that is taking the lead for submitting something to Granted. We want to see individuals who are in the positions of the research enterprise lead these proposals. We want to see the definition of a PI expand out tremendously from a traditional faculty member to areas of the research enterprise. And we acknowledge that there are new areas, especially in research security and data science requirements and so on, that are so new that we actually didn't really highlight them on the infographic that we've been using for a while now. We need to update that infographic. But as you see new things coming and say, gosh, we really need to get ahead of this, how are we going to come together and come up with solutions in this space? If it's relevant in that backbone and infrastructure to the success of the nation's research competitiveness, it probably fits within Granted. But what Granted is not intended to support is core disciplinary research. We have plenty of that other places at NSF. It's not about traditional student training, like a stipend for a graduate student to go through a program in engineering or something like that. And it's not meant to fund research postdocs that are, again, disciplinarily aligned, even if all of these types of things are about trying to grow equity and diversity. We are really, Granted is so vast right now, just thinking about the research enterprise, that we are starting our pathway to incorporating more people in the success for their research programs by focusing on the research enterprise and these positions that make it up, rather than focusing in disciplines. However, there could be disciplines, especially professional societies, that come forward and say, but we want to contribute too. We want to take the lead at enhancing pre and post award. Even though we're coming from physics, we want to contribute to this national need. So I'm not meaning to say that disciplines aren't welcome in any way. This is such an inclusive program. I really don't want to not include anybody. But at the same time, we know that we have other programs at NSF that fit the bill for disciplinary research programs, and so on. So those are there, and then granted is different. So we had a webinar last Wednesday, and we are cleaning up the video, and we will post it on the nsf.gov/granted website. But we will have another webinar on February 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern. But given that proposals are due March 15th, we know that people have questions. We are encouraging people to email us at granted@nsf.gov if they have ideas. We also have a new portal at NSF called Prospect, and the website there is suitability.nsf.gov. And I actually didn't put this in my slides, but when I send the slides back to the FTP organizers, I'll make sure it's in there. This suitability.nsf.gov is a portal where people can put ideas, very brief ideas. These are not proposals, brief ideas, a paragraph. Here's what I'm thinking. And you can send it in, and then on the back end, NSF will figure out where it needs to go. That's for any idea, not just for granted, not just for TIP. It can be any idea. So encourage your faculty, other people at your university, if they are seeking funding from NSF and they just want feedback on their general idea, the suitability.nsf.gov is a great portal to just send that idea in and then get a response based on who we find in the background at NSF to reply. So let me talk just a few more minutes about granted and some of the ideas and areas that we want to emphasize or call out and highlight. So there are a few things that we've seen that we think are some critical issues. Being able to build, empower, and energize this research enterprise community. And that's you all, but also so many other people that aren't part of FTP, or that they are within institutions that are FTP institutions, but they don't attend this kind of meeting to hear this. But we really want to connect across the areas of the research enterprise. We think there are common solutions that can be applied in different venues, but we're also looking to identify different populations of people or different types of institutions that have similar challenges so that they can come together again, maybe with a granted convening, and share ideas about how they could pose solutions and get some funding through the next granted opportunity to help them build out that solution. We also are looking for nationally transformative and scalable models, training curricula, competitive approaches, different things, programs. Again, institutions have wonderful ideas about how to be competitive for a multitude of programs. I used to run one for the Career Award, NSF Career. I know that institutions have things for Graduate Research Fellowship Program. So how do we make those nationally transformative, scalable, and accessible, regardless of what institution you happen to be a student at, or faculty, or staff member, whatever. So how do we get beyond our institutional barriers? And again, think nationally about the competitiveness of the nation. And as I've said before, engaging professional societies to address many of these major challenges in the research enterprise is critical to the success of granted. We also, back to this intentionality of building the workforce, thinking about human capital barriers, including career pathways, how people recruit for these positions. I said earlier that people accidentally sometimes find these positions. Being intentional about mentoring, about retention, how people's career pathways are different. I showed my career pathway. I'm very different, but I've been very successful in this space. So how are we being more intentional, and how are we helping people find this kind of line of work? And then developing institutional financial systems. This is kind of totally different, but we know that a lot of ERIs struggle, especially in leading significant funding programs, because their financial systems aren't set up to handle external funding in the way that maybe a more well-resourced institution is. So how could we get together across areas of financial, let's have a convening of CFOs at ERIs to talk about supporting research, something that helps bring forward some of those challenges at a national level and bring people together that have, it's their job to figure these things out. So some of the feedback from the webinar went very well. This first webinar, we had over 1,800 people register and over 1,100 people attend. And I like seeing these very positive statements, but I'm also happy to hear things like, well, you really should be doing this, or maybe you should focus on this. But these are very heartening and encouraging types of comments. So thank you to people who really recognize that this was filling a gap. And it's a way in which we are trying to think differently about the work that we're doing at NSF. And then finally, I want to just talk very high level about the evolution of grant and the pathway that we believe the initiative is going to follow. So we think it's very important through what we fund in the granted initiative that the knowledge that's gained be accessible to all and to lead to a continual evolution and improvement of different strategies and approaches that are made available. This shouldn't be about hoarding knowledge and making it accessible just to a small set of institutions. I know from being in professional societies in the research enterprise, it's very collaborative, and knowledge sharing is free flowing and very much encouraged. So how do we do that on a bigger scale across different areas? And how do we make sure that institutions that haven't necessarily been engaged in national professional societies or in national communities feel that they have access to that same kind of information, same kinds of training and perspective? This national transformation has to happen over time. So we have to keep that in mind, but we want to make sure that when we fund things through the granted initiative, that even if it's an idea that's a little bit more local or regionally scoped out, that it has the potential for national transformation. So we can certainly talk about ideas around that idea, but what we're looking for is to get to that national transformation. We recognize from, say, a broader impacts perspective that not every idea will be automatically nationally transformative. We think that partnerships and collaborations are the key to success within granted. So if a person or a set of people at one institution have a great idea, we encourage people to go and find other institutions to participate in ideas for granted. We're not going to get to national transformation very quickly if it's one person or one institution at a time. There are many, many networks that already exist that we want to leverage for the success of granted. And so we're a little impatient. So we want to make sure that people find each other. And these convenings, we have talked within NSF about how to make visible what's come in or what we fund as part of the convenings DCL. So we're still working on what that format would look like. But if you look at the regional innovation engines coming out of TIP, they had a Tableau website that showed where all the concept papers came from and where all the invited proposals went to. And so all of that kind of information allowed people to find one another if they wanted to. So I think that's a fabulous idea for granted. And then future funding opportunities, as I said before, we're planning one right now, but from the fiber of my being, they will be broad and inclusive. So we've gotten a lot of questions from the webinar. Can R1s participate in granted? Yes. Can ERIs participate in granted and lead them? Yes. There's not a whole lot of things that I'm going to say, absolutely not, no way, you can't do that. I'm sure there are a few, but generally speaking, we are trying to make the granted program live what we want to see. We want to see broad inclusivity. We want access. We want people to share. We want people to participate. We don't want to put up a lot of barriers and boundaries. We're trying to reduce those. We know that some institutions will not let staff be PIs of research grants. Well, we're letting that happen. We're going to allow that at NSF. Maybe that's a great conversation to talk about an institutional barrier around that. Sometimes institutions don't let part-time faculty or part-time staff lead PI or be a PI on a proposal. I certainly, having been in academic institutions, understand that, but that's also a great way to have a conversation about how that serves as a barrier and could be something that could be removed. So that's the end of my remarks. I am happy to take questions. I would love to have a discussion. I can't promise all the answers, but I will do my very best. And again, slides are going to be available to everybody. I will plug in a couple of things before I send them on. But thank you so much for your time. Here's how to get in touch with me or the granted team. Thank you so much for the time. And I know we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Alicia, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. There is a question. Will Granted be partnering with other federal agencies like NASA, NOAA, EPA, USDA?
In the future, yes, that's my plan, or our plan. And part of getting Granted started, as we're finding out as we talk more and more and more about this, is that people who are deep in the research enterprise usually get this right away. Folks who aren't or aren't familiar with it, it takes a little longer to come along. So we thought it would be easiest to start this from NSF and then work very hard and fast to try to make this significant partnerships with other agencies and other organizations.
And I don't see any other questions right now, but I would just add to your comments on that with the other agencies. I think some of us are aware of certain other agencies that have similar initiatives that were already ongoing before the CHIPS and Science Act, but that just kind of accelerates this.
That's right. And so, for example, I'm familiar with the SPAD program, or however you want to pronounce that, that's had a number of different names over time. And those have been very focused in on helping institutions make some adjustments and changes and try some new things out. And I would love to see people who have had SPAD investments apply for Granted and scale up what they did. But it's this national transformation piece is really critical. What we've seen coming out of the pandemic, if we're out, I don't know. But what we have seen is really a lot of fragility in the research enterprise. And it's one of those things that keeps me up at night. I'm worried. I'm worried that we don't have enough people coming into these positions. I'm worried by retirements. I helped a lot of people find research leadership, mentoring, and networking. It's exhausting being in positions where there's a lot of turnover, or there are people who have decided this is an overwhelming type of profession and so on. But we, again, aren't really intentional in helping people find these positions. It's still too based in serendipity. So there's so much we can do nationally that I think can really help the research enterprise become much more solidified.
So Alicia, I have to say, this was an amazing presentation because
Thank you.
As a research administrator, I fell into it as well. And we have done nothing but talk about the massive brain drain that I think all of our institutions have felt. Now, hopefully they're going to other institutions and finding, using their expertise, but there is that feeling of you spend all these years training, and a lot of it isn't, we have our professional associations, but a lot of it's on the job, and then you just lose them to somewhere else. And so I'm wondering if when we're talking about infrastructure and capacity, if there's thought about, I saw that you mentioned retention, but if it is one of the ideas is how do you, if you do lose them, what is a good onboarding? Like, would that be something that NSF would be interested in? That how do you get them up to speed when you find somebody that maybe doesn't know what a research administrator is? Now, how do you make them be a research administrator quickly?
Yeah, right. And, the onboarding and on-the-job training and where different professions that might lend themselves more readily to a research admin or a research enterprise type position. There's probably a whole lot of ideas, but are they tested? So we would be interested in understanding how people could set up ways in which to test those ideas. So again, with the convening DCL, Dear Colleague Letter, you would bring people together to talk about those ideas. And then hopefully you would form ideas together and be able to plan a proposal that could come in the next funding opportunity that we're working on right now, which is really about how are we going to provide the funding for people to do projects, to test out things, to build things, to put them in different contexts, to bring in more people that have never been, part of a training program or something like that. So there's, I can generate a new idea every minute if I had the time. There's so many things that I think we could be doing. We are also limited by the amount of money that eventually gets allocated. I don't have like a final number quite yet, but we had asked for $50 million in the first year, which is not nearly enough to do, I think, what we imagine doing, but we need to show some great proofs of concept. And, this, keeping in mind that national transformation will happen over time, if people, when they submit their proposals, can really speak in the broader impacts to that national transformation, that will help us out quite a bit.
Alicia, I want to add my voice to saying, how appreciative I am of this really comprehensive look at this program, which I think is, so heavily needed across the country. Do you anticipate ever investing through this program in the kinds of programs one sees in disciplinary fields where you even find, a cohort of people who learn a set of skills and then grow into the field, and subsidizing some of the cost of that?
Yeah, so let me take just a slightly different angle that's a little bit more on the NSF side, or what motivates us. So just like I said, that TIP is not only a directorate, but a concept that we're all embracing throughout NSF. I think Granted has some of the same flavor, that not everyone at NSF knows what goes on in the research enterprise. They are probably more familiar with the faculty member that submits a proposal in their discipline and gets an award, and then they go to conferences and so on, rather than the research administration or the research development professional who helped them devise that idea. So to what extent can we highlight inside the agency the different parts and segments of the research enterprise, which will then, I think, help people in programmatic areas in the directorates start to see how they have a role to play in making the research enterprise successful nationally. And so I suspect, and I already have people reaching out from inside NSF to say, how can we help? What can we do? And so, based on having more conversations, seeing some of these DCL ideas, when we award some convenings, inviting other staff from NSF to come to those convenings, really helping people build out their own knowledge of the research enterprise inside the agency will only help the efforts that we're doing by broadening the base of people who are working in this area.
So Alicia, I just want to ask one more question about that. I understand that at this point, it's more of a convening, let's talk about proposals, but the elephant in the room is funding, right? Sure. Like our administrative caps have been capped for 20 some years, right? There's no additional money. And, I can say at a well-resourced institution, it's still a conversation. So what is the plan for building these programs for, to build a capacity if there's not funding for them to pay for the staff that are going to support that research enterprise?
So I'll put a big challenge out there for, again, national leaders that before we started talking about Granted, and although there have been other conversations about how to make some of the especially proposal development more accessible to more people, the putting Granted out there and talking about this has given people permission to think about innovation in this space. They could have been doing this for years before Granted, and they have been. I don't want to say they haven't been. But having a program like this, it's like a giant flashlight to say, look, this is important. if we don't make sure that the research enterprise, this infrastructure that supports the competitiveness of all of this other stuff isn't there, then all the other awards that NSF wants to make won't be effective. So we need, and every other federal agency. So by having this giant, let's call it a spotlight instead of a flashlight. Flashlight seems too small for me. A big spotlight. Then let's have those conversations about where we see other policy barriers, like a federal cap for F&A, or we see barriers to shine it back on NSF. Tell us where there's a barrier that's really preventing that access and inclusion that we say we want to have. You know, what are some of the uniform guidance things that really aren't necessary? Or is there a test bed that we could create nationally to try out some things that, and you guys are perfect for this, FDP, you're already a test bed. So what is it that you could do that scales what you've done in the past, or a brand new area that you just never had the opportunity or the spotlight helps you do now that maybe you couldn't do before? And I'll give one other kind of quick aside to this. Several years ago, congressionally, there was sort of a threat to F&A to say, we should just cap it at 10%. You remember all, and there were briefings and panels and all this stuff. We should never be caught on our heels like that. How are we being proactive in the policy space in this way? We have to talk about the fragility of the research enterprise and why F&A, or maybe some other way of funding that infrastructure, is critical to making sure it's sustained. So let's talk about new things, not just the concepts we are familiar with now and maybe annoyed by. What are the new solutions that we could create?
Alicia, I wanted to share, there's an observation or suggestion and also another question.
Okay.
So the observation suggestion is that our profession could do a better job by presenting at job fairs and careers, making our profession known as a profession. So that's one thing.
Yep.
And then the question is there a place in the granted program for SBIR proposals?
So, well, it depends on, let me put it this way. So companies that do SBIR, STTR work often do not have research infrastructure to help them be successful. They kind of stumble into this. It's more serendipity and, you know, just figuring things out. So I don't know, like, I'm not as familiar with what companies have created for research infrastructure. I'd be really curious about that. So if there was some convening that was all about illuminating what companies do with research enterprise functions, that'd be fascinating, I think, because I mean, I don't know. But am I going to fund an SBIR, STTR kind of proposal? I think that's where SBIR, STTR collaborates with Granted to figure that out. One thing I want to stress that we saw a lot of in the webinar, Granted is not a program that's new and you have your thing, you've been trying to get funded other places and you're just going to try this because it's new. This is very specific about what it is that we are trying to do with Granted. And so it's very important that people see this as, you know, research enterprise functionality. It is, there are ways in which conferences and convenings can be funded in other places at NSF. So it's not like this is the only conference and convening opportunity at NSF. We've pointed people into the PAPG, where there's just this general funding mechanism for conferences. That's what we're using for this particular call for proposals. But people can do that in their discipline. I don't know if SBIR, STTR has convenings. That's a question I can look into and get back. But I think that I'm not entirely sure exactly how else to interpret that question.
I am
Any
not
other-
seeing any other questions.
Well, again, we are happy to take questions granted at nsf.gov is the quickest way to get answers. We're meticulous about keeping that inbox empty, so we answer things as soon as possible. The suitability.nsf.gov is a great way to get ideas for anything at NSF put out and to be considered. And we have somebody who's set up to receive all of those ideas. We have a lot of people who are reaching out saying, hey, how about this idea? What do you think of this? And we're happy to answer those. We also, have Zoom conversations and so on. But I really want to encourage people to expand outside of their maybe typical communities or people that they know already and try to break down those boundaries. We are really trying to make Granted a boundaryless program. And maybe we won't even need the infographic with sort of segments and everything. It will be very blended over time. But I just really, I want to be impressed. I want to see, and it's not just, I'm spearheading the vision for this program. I have program officers who are going to do the work of evaluating the proposals and everything that way. We want to be impressed with some really fabulous ideas, and we know it's possible. So we want to encourage people to reach out just to make sure that maybe they're thinking the right way, or that their idea is going kind of far enough for what it is that we're looking for. I see a question. Do you have a current NSF grantee to propose a granted? Oh, do you have to be a current NSF grantee? No, you do not. Again, inclusion, super important. So you do not have to, this isn't a supplement or anything like this. You could be a brand new person. Now, if your institution or organization has never gotten funding from NSF, there are some extra hoops that we have to jump through to establish you as a new organization for NSF. But keep that in mind in terms of when you want to plan your convening. This
think
must
there's-
be, oh, go ahead, Maria.
I was just going to say there's a comment from Trish Brock, just saying thank you. It's wonderful to hear recognition of these concerns at a national level. So I think that's, well put. Thank you, Trish, for that comment.
Yes, I appreciate that. And, this is, again, it's a very different way of thinking inside of NSF from just the population of people that this engages. I did present at the Society for Research Administrators International and said in the course of that presentation that I'd love to see people in research enterprise positions be the PIs of these proposals. And there was an audible gasp in the room. So I can't see that on Zoom, but I'm super hopeful that we will introduce a whole new set of people who are leading funding proposals through this program too.
We are so grateful for your time this afternoon and taking the effort to really distill this program for us. On behalf of Alex and the entire FDP, we want to really express that thanks and to thank all of our guests who have stayed with us through the very, very last plenary session of our meeting. We are very much looking forward to seeing everybody in person in May. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex for her final words as we draw this FDP meeting to conclusion. Alex.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, again, Alicia, your presentation was so inspiring. I can't wait to come up with 5 proposals on what we should be doing, but it is inspiring that, we always talk about the fragility, and really we are, we love our PIs, but we recognize, and most of them recognize that they need administrators to be able to really do what they do. And that's what we get enjoyment out of, is facilitating that amazing research. So I just think this is a great program, and what a great way to cap off this excellent FDP meeting, our January meeting. Thanks again to our program committee and all of our co-chairs and everybody that presented. And yes, look forward to seeing everybody in May. So thank you and have a good evening or afternoon.
Thanks so much, Alicia.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We
And
now
Susan.
stand
Thank you.
adjourned. Bye, everyone.